Welcome everyone to the next installment of the M Cubed series, Remapping Peoples of the Book, Theorizing Abrahamic Vernaculars. I'm Ryan Speech in the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and Romance Languages and Literatures. And this is a series we've co-organized, a group of faculty from the University of Michigan, including Rebecca Wallenberg, myself, and a number of other faculty members from history, anthropology, Middle East studies, and elsewhere. So I'd like to begin just by thanking the M Cubed program and the Office for Research at the University of Michigan, as well as the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, and the departments that have helped organize or supported us, including Middle Eastern Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern North African Studies, and the program in Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Just before we begin, let me also point ahead to our next event, so you can put it on your calendars. We have on April 20th, another talk in this series called The Buddha in the 10th to the 17th Centuries, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Narratives, which will be delivered by Shata Al-Mutawa from American University, joined in a roundtable discussion with Dalia Yasharpour. So please mark your calendars. That'll be at the same time at 12 to 1:30 here at the Frankel Center Zoom channel. So without any further ado, it's a great honor to turn to our speaker today. A real pleasure personally and professionally to welcome Sarah Stroumsa, who is the Alice and Jack Ormet Professor of Arabic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she also served as former rector, the first female rector in the history of the university. She is the author of numerous books, including, which many of you are familiar with, including the most widely hailed Maimonides in His World, Portrait of a Mediterranean Thinker from 2009 at Princeton, and Free Thinkers of Medieval Islam, Ibn al-Ruwandi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, and Their Impact on Islamic Thought from 1999, plus numerous other books, as well as numerous editions that are important, at least in my world, such as the Judeo-Arabic Philosophical Polemic, 20 chapters by Dawood ibn Marwan al-Muqamis, and the co-edition with Daniel Lasker of the Polemic of Nestor the Priest, the Kisat Mujadlat al-Uskuf, or Sefer Nestor HaKomer, and numerous others. She's also the author of some 60 academic articles and chapters on diverse subjects in medieval philosophy, religion, polemic, cultural history, and other subjects. So she's truly a leading giant in the field, someone to whom we all turn to and enjoy reading, and we're really delighted to have her speak today. To have her back at Michigan after a little bit of a hiatus. I had the pleasure of having her here 10 years ago at a conference I organized. And so it's a real pleasure to have you back with us. I wish we could be here in physical presence, but being together on Zoom we'll have to do for today. So it's really wonderful. And I'd like to just say a word about how we will be proceeding. Today, after the talk, we will be joined by Jessica Andruss from the University of Virginia, who will then join Professor Stroumsa in dialogue. And we'll have a short dialogue. I'll introduce Professor Andruss after the talk, and then we'll have a short dialogue between them, and then open the forum up for questions from the public. So at this point, any questions you have, please send them to me in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll collect them in order, and we can present them to Professor Stroumsa after the talk. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stroumsa, who will speak today on Our Father, the Medieval Abrahamic Religions. Thank you, Professor Stroumsa.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you and Professor Rebecca Wallenberg for convening this lecture series. To thank Jessica Andruss for agreeing to jump on this wagon, two-dimensional wagon on a rather short notice. And to thank Kelsey, who guided us through this process. While what we euphemistically continue to call COVID-19, which is by now COVID-21, forces me to postpone the pleasure of revisiting Ann Arbor this virtual invitation gives me the opportunity to complement and readjust a previous article I first presented at a conference also organized by Ryan Spitz is it already 10 years ago? And then published by him. In that article, I discussed the universalist image of Abraham held by two medieval philosophers in Islamic Spain. Today, I would like to discuss the broader, more widely diffused image of Abraham among Jews and Muslims in the medieval Islamicate world, in the hope that this more general background will also highlight the significance of its distinct interpretation by some philosophers. In contemporary parlance, the term Abrahamic religions serves to indicate the common ground of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The designation of these three religions as Abrahamic is used as a shorthand for their supposed common ancestry, as well as for their assumed shared religious principles and values. Since its very purpose is to highlight the commonality of the three religions, the term is almost always used in the plural. It should be noted that it is in a secular age that our use of the term Abrahamic religions was coined, an age in which national and ethnic identities have often replaced religion as primary identifiers. In the contemporary interconfessional context, the term is typically used by people for whom religion counts in an attempt to soften discords that have some religious colorings but are essentially ethnic or national. Medieval thinkers of the Islamicate world discussed the religion of the patriarch Abraham and presented him as a model of their own religiosity. The use of this model by Jews, Christians, and Muslims can mislead us into thinking that they meant the same thing as we do, and cause us to search for the roots of the modern concept of Abrahamic religions in its medieval antecedents. In the religious age of the Islamicate medieval world, however, the perception of Abraham's religiosity was radically different from what is intended in the contemporary concept of Abrahamic religions. As I will try to show, when medieval thinkers invoked the religion of Abraham, they did so either in order to highlight the exclusive veracity of one specific religion, their own, or much more rarely in order to transcend all conventional religiosity. In either case, for them, the concept of Abrahamic religion was always in the singular. And I will stop here for a moment to share my screen with you, and I hope that this will help us through some of the texts that I'd like to share with you. The exclusivist understanding of Abraham's religion is attested already in late antiquity, when the rabbis and the early Christians, followed by the church fathers, compete for Abraham's inheritance. Already the Mishnah turns the biblical "your father Abraham" into "our father Abraham," molding him as a rabbinic Jew. For the Talmudic sages, Abraham observed all the laws of the Torah, and the Midrash adds a division of labor between Abraham and Sarah in proselytizing for Judaism, saying, I quote, Abraham was converting the men, converting to Judaism, while Sarah was converting the women. Like the Jewish sages, the New Testament mentions, I quote, the oath which God swore to Abraham our father. But in the epistle to the Galatians, Paul specifies whose father is intended, I quote, Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. That is to say, the Christians rather than the Jews. The strife over the right to be considered Abraham's spiritual progeny becomes drastically more pronounced with the appearance of Islam, and it is boldly and repeatedly stated in its foundational text, the Quran. The Quranic presentation of Abraham impacts the whole discussion of the patriarch in the medieval Islamicate world, and thus merits that we dwell on it at some length in our discussion today. Let us review some of the most explicit verses, paying attention to the specific, almost technical vocabulary. And I apologize in advance for introducing quite a lot of technical vocabulary into this talk, but I hope you will be able to follow without difficulty. So the first example is Quran 3:67 to 68, which states, Abraham was not a Jew nor a Christian, but rather a Hanif, a Muslim, and not one of the Mushrikun. Without doubt, the people most worthy of Abraham are those who follow him, as well as this present prophet, namely Muhammad, and those who believe. The association of being a Hanif with being a Muslim, both in red here, in whatever sense we take these words, is also made in Quran 4:125, which says, and who has a better religion than one who submits himself, aslama, the same root as Muslim, to God, does right and follows the millah of Abraham as a Hanif. God has taken Abraham for a friend. The terms millah and Muslim also appear in Quran 22, verse 78. It is the millah of your father Abraham. He called you Muslimun before and in this revelation, that the messenger may bear witness on you and that you may be witnesses on the people. Modern scholarship has offered various explanations for the substantives that are used to describe Abraham in these verses, often following the medieval Muslim commentators, but occasionally dissenting from them. Let us briefly review these recurring terms. Excuse me. The term Hanif is usually understood as referring to a person retaining the unadulterated monotheism that is ingrained in human beings since birth, in fact, since creation. Some scholars, however, point to its background in the sectarian milieu in which Islam appeared and to its possible origins in the cognate Syriac Hanputha as a derogative term for Christian heretics. The Mushrikun, those who associate partners with God, are usually identified as polytheist pagans, although in modern scholarship, it has been suggested that they too were in some ways monotheists. Even the word Muslim, which traditional Muslim exegetes as a matter of course understand as catching the essence of their own religion, has been mitigated in modern scholarship to mean wholehearted devotion to the one God, rather than identification with the specific religion called Islam. But whichever interpretation we choose for explaining the positive descriptions of Abraham's religiosity, as we have seen, the Quran states clearly that the followers of Muhammad are closest to Abraham, and adds negative, unambiguous qualifications to clarify this same religiosity. Abraham was not from the Mushrikun, not a Jew, not a Christian. The polemical edge of this perception of Abraham is expressed perhaps even more clearly in Quran 20:135, which says, "They said, be Jews or Christians, and you will be following the right way. Say not so, but rather follow the religion, the millah of Abraham as a Hanif. He was not one of the mushrikun." Already in Quranic terms, therefore, Judaism and Christianity are no Abrahamic religions. In this last verse, we are introduced to another key term, millah, usually translated as religion. This term appears in the Quran 14 times, 7 of which refer to the millah of Abraham, and one more time referring to the millah of the Jews and the Christians. 3 of these 7 occurrences are traditionally listed as Meccan surahs, that is to say, dating from Muhammad's early career, and the other 4 as Medinan, at the height of Muhammad's conflict with the local Jews. Akin to millah is the word ummah, which appears in Quran 16:20. Abraham was indeed an ummah, devoutly obedient to God, a Hanif, and was not one of the mushrikun. Ummah is often translated anachronistically as a nation, but as the comparison with the previously quoted verses show, it would be a mistake to conclude from this verse, as Uri Rubin does, that Abraham represents a kind of supernation embracing all peoples who belongs to none of the established religions. In offering Abraham as the model, the Ummah, for the Muslims, the Quran identifies his religion with Islam to the exclusion of other religions. At the same time, this primeval religion of Abraham is also presented as humans' natural, inbuilt religiosity. Quran 30:30 admonishes the Prophet, saying, "So set your face to the faith as a Hanif. This is the fitra of God on which he patterned all people. The original creation of God cannot be replaced." Abraham's religion, the religion of the Hanif, is thus identical with the fitra, the pristine, inborn knowledge of God, which the Prophet Muhammad reaffirms. This term, fitra, a Quranic hapax legomenon, is crucial for understanding the medieval perception of the Abrahamic religion, and we will return to it further below. At this point, we should only note that as this Quranic verse shows, the fitra is and has always been identical with Islam, whereas Judaism and Christianity are but later attempts to replace God's creation. The repeated Quranic statements are then further elaborated in Muslim exegetical literature, one example of which may suffice. Commenting on Quran 2:135, the 12th century theologian Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi says, "If someone would say that both the Jews and the Christians claim that they are following the religion of Abraham, we say, since it was established that Abraham believed in monotheism, and that the Christians believe in the Trinity, and that the Jews believe in anthropomorphic representations of God, then it is established that they are not following the religion of Abraham, and that Muhammad, since he advocated monotheism, it is he who was following the religion of Abraham." In the early medieval times, Muslims, Jews, and Christians were thus, of course, aware of the fact that the patriarch was an important figure for the followers of the other two religions. Generally speaking, however, when they presented him as an ancestral figure or when they put him up as a model to be followed, this concerned solely their own religion. Furthermore, in other contexts, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish thinkers occasionally noted the similarities between the three religions, and sometimes even tried to highlight them. But when they did, the inclusion of Abraham in the list of prophets is not counted as one of these similarities. In what follows, I will focus on two medieval thinkers in whose writings the figure of Abraham takes a prominent place, and these are the same two thinkers, the universalist aspect of the view of Abraham I presented almost 10 years ago. These are, okay, so let's begin with the 10th century Muslim mystical philosopher Ibn Masara, and then the 12th century Jewish philosopher Maimonides. For different reasons, these two play a cardinal role in the development of medieval Muslim and Jewish philosophy. Ibn Masara is the influential first thinker in the resplendent Andalusian line of mystical philosophy. Maimonides is the single most important Jewish medieval philosopher. I have written elsewhere about their fascination with Abraham, reflected in their writings as well as in details of their biography. In the present context, however, it is only their understanding of Abraham's religion which will concern us. Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Masara of Cordova is known as the first Andalusian philosopher. His two extant treatises reveal a complex and highly sophisticated Neoplatonic worldview. His mystical philosophy is reminiscent of what can also be found in Fatimi Ismaili writings of the same period. His language borrows much from the Quran, and the philosophical terminology he employs can later be found in the writings of other mystical philosophers in Al-Andalus, that is Islamic Spain, from the Jewish Solomon ibn Gabirol in the 11th century to the Muslim Ibn al-Arabi in the 13th. A particular original trait of Ibn Masara's thought is the way he uses the concept of contemplation, i'tibar. For Ibn Masara, contemplation is a mental practice permitting the ascent through the different levels of existence to the uppermost levels of knowledge, up to the encounter with the Creator. The process of contemplation as a whole follows the scriptural model of Abraham. According to the Quran, Surah 6, Abraham came to know God after observing the successive daily decline of the heavenly bodies, thus realizing their limitations and transiency. Although Ibn Masara does not explicitly cite the relevant Quranic verses, he clearly has them in mind, and the Quranic narrative of Abraham's search is echoed throughout Ibn Masara's epistle. Like Abraham, Ibn Masara's contemplation moves from the lower levels of existence to the higher ones, to which the lower realms are subjugated. This stresses the human intellectual effort involved in the quest, through which a human being can reach the level of certitude, be granted revelation, receive reward, and be enlightened, and for which all human beings are prepared by means of innate nature, fitra. The Quranic image of Abraham as a contemplator goes back to Jewish apocryphal literature from the Second Temple period, such as the Book of Jubilees, and to Jewish Hellenistic and Midrashic literature. The Midrash probably starts from the verse of Genesis 15:5, where God's promise to the already old Abraham to have countless offspring is brought home to him by the call to look at the stars and count them. And this is the picture that went into the poster of this lecture. It is a woodcut by the Polish Jewish artist Maurycy Lilian. Ibn Masara, of course, is not familiar with the Midrash, but his works show that he must have had direct contacts with contemporary Jews and that he was exposed to contemporary Jewish thought associated with the Book of Creation, Sefer Yetzirah, a work of letter mysticism whose last paragraph associates this kind of speculation with Abraham. It is therefore possible that Ibn Masara's fascination with Abraham was also nourished by his encounters with contemporary Jews and their traditions. In his writings, however, the passages that betray his curiosity regarding Jews are not tied in any way to those connected to his understanding of the Abrahamic model. As can be expected, Ibn Masara writes as a Muslim, whose thought mainly elaborates material found in Muslim tradition, Quran and Hadith. His description of the process of contemplation is calqued in Quranic language. His latter speculation is anchored in the structure of the Quran and tied to Quranic imagery. In Ibn Masara's Epistle of Contemplation, probably the earlier of his two extant works, Abraham is the only prophet mentioned by name. Ibn Masara says plainly that what can be achieved by intellectual contemplation, for which Abraham is the model, is identical with what is taught by revelation. He underlies the inborn human potential, the fitra, to achieve religious certitude, but one gets the distinct impression that when describing the way for actualizing this potential, he thinks in terms of the revelation of Muhammad. The hierarchy of the three monotheistic religions is made explicit in Ibn Masara's second work, the Book of Letters, where he says, revelation was given to four prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Abraham received revelation from the lower level, Moses from the level above it, Jesus from the middle, and Muhammad from the highest level, which is the one nearest to the highest invocation and the greatest light. Ibn Masara's ranking of prophets is not strictly consistent, and in his mystical creativity, he plays with the elements provided by Muslim tradition, moving them around. He thus includes Abraham also in a different cluster of prophets. The 13th century mystic Ibn al-Arabi reports that Ibn Masara presented Abraham as one of three prophets associated with God's governance and his throne, Adam, Abraham, and Muhammad. Whereas Abraham is granted an important role in this report, being in charge of livelihood and sustenance and paired with the archangel Gabriel, Moses and Jesus are wholly absent from this cluster. In both clusters, however, it is obvious that in Ibn Masara's reflection on Abraham's religion, contemporary Judaism and Christianity are not perceived as equal to Islam. Like Ibn Masara, the Jewish Moses Maimonides taps into the midrashic account of the infant Abraham who comes to know his creator through contemplation. Maimonides' Abraham, however, does not remain a contemplative recluse, but becomes the first activist prophet. Having used his own judgment to attain true monotheism, He then rebelled against the pagan polytheism prevalent in his native Chaldean Ur and Haran, and Maimonides dedicates many pages to analyzing the intellectual and spiritual milieu in which Abraham was raised. Abraham suffered persecution by his contemporary Sabians, the pagans, and was rewarded with divine blessing, that in him, as Genesis says, all the family of the earth would be blessed. For Maimonides, Abraham is indeed the blessing for all the families of the earth, the father of all true monotheists, past, present, and future. We would be mistaken, however, to deduct from the universalist image of Abraham as the father of many nations that Maimonides regards Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as equally Abrahamic. Their hierarchy is clear in Maimonides' attitude to converts, a subject with which I have dealt more in detail elsewhere. Stepping up as the first monotheist in a world of ubiquitous idolatry, Abraham was, so to speak, the first convert, and as such, the father of all converts after him. Any proselyte who casts away his erroneous upbringing and activates his fitra, his inborn potential of true monotheistic religiosity, undergoes a total transformation and becomes a true offspring of Abraham. As Maimonides says, a disciple of Abraham, our father, who left his fathers and his land to follow God. For Maimonides, Abraham serves as a universal model, showing that people can join the community of the true religion, whatever their ancestry may be. There is no difference in this respect between proselytes who come from what Maimonides sees as thoroughly idolatrous religions, Indian, African, Babylonian, or Greek, and those who were previously Muslims or Christians. All are expected to convert to Judaism, accept its religious principles, and follow its law. Once they have done so, and only then, they are considered to be children of Abraham, that is to say, Jews. It is only in this way, through conversion, that our father Abraham is also the father of many nations. Despite the absence of the idea of multiple Abrahamic religions, the commonality of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which the modern concept of Abrahamic tries to convey, was also noted by medieval thinkers. This is clearly spelled out by Maimonides, who writes in his Guide of the Perplexed 171, "There is no doubt that there are things that are common to all three of us, I mean the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, namely the affirmation of the temporal creation of the world, the validity of which entails the validity of miracles and other things of that kind." Strikingly, the things Maimonides lists as common to the three religions do not include a common ancestry, nor the belief in a single deity, but rather the creation ex nihilo, which he regards as the necessary theoretical basis for a prophetic religion. Maimonides continues to spell out the differences between the three religions. As for the other matters that these two communities, Christianity and Islam, took the trouble to treat and were engrossed in, for instance, the study of the notion of Trinity into which the Christians plunged, and the study of the Kalam into which certain sects of the Muslims plunged, these are things that we do not require in any respect whatever. Just as he did in pointing out the similarities between the three religions, here too Maimonides focuses on theoretical concepts: the Christian notion of the Trinity, the Muslim notion of the pre-eternal kalam or divine speech as manifested in the Quran. Noteworthy in Maimonides' presentation is the fact that while Christianity and Islam have other matters that these two communities took the trouble to treat and were engrossed in, or conceptions into the study of which they had plunged, and notions that are peculiar to each one of the two communities, Judaism has no such matters. The implications of this difference is that for Maimonides, revealed religion in its pristine state, the fitra, would be equivalent to Judaism. In the philosophical context of his Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides refrains from adducing the Historia Sacra as either a unifying or a separating component of the three religions. Abraham, as for that matter, the other prophets of the Hebrew Bible, does not figure as a common theologumenon, and Jesus or Muhammad are not mentioned here as demarcating the distinctiveness of Christianity or Islam. Maimonides does mention Muhammad and Jesus as false prophets in his epistle to Yemen. In this polemical setting, he also says that God's promise to Abraham and all his blessings apply only to the descendants of Isaac. And he, the exalted, said explicitly, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, omitting Ishmael. Nevertheless, Islam and Christianity do play a role in Maimonides' salvation history. Comparing the situation in his time to that in the days of the patriarchs who lived in a Sabian, pagan environment, he says, somewhat obliquely, in the belief in the existence of the deity, if the belief in the existence of the deity were not generally accepted at present to such an extent in the religious communities, our days in these times would be even darker than that epoch. The meaning of this opaque statement is more clearly expressed in Maimonides' earlier work, the Mishneh Torah, where he writes, as far as the Jewish nation is concerned, these two religions only pave the way for the Messiah to prepare the whole world to worship God in unison. When the true King Messiah will appear, when he succeeds and is exalted and glorious, they will all repent immediately. They will then realize that they've inherited naught and that their prophets and ancestors led them astray. Despite their respective errors, Christianity and Islam represent for Maimonides a progress compared to previous beliefs of their nations. Without these two religions, our days in these times would be even darker. Notwithstanding their erroneous belief, they pave the way for the Messiah, serving as stepping stones on the way to the universal spread of the truth. Ibn Masara and Maimonides exemplify the fact that most medieval thinkers in the Islamicate world did not consider Abrahamic ancestry or Abrahamic religiosity as something that they shared with adherents of other religions. Both of them also exemplify the way medieval thinkers portrayed the religion of Abraham in the image of their own religion. But another element in the portrayal of Abraham deserves to be noted: the association of the religion of Abraham with the Quranic notion of the fitra. the inborn human ability to get closer to truth. The full implication of this notion for some philosophers can be best seen in the writings of a third thinker, Maimonides' Muslim contemporary Abul Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, known to the Latins as Averroes. In his polemical defense of Aristotelian philosophy, the Tahafut at-Tahafut, translated usually as the incoherence of the incoherence, Averroes writes, "The philosophers believe that religious laws are necessary political acts, the principles of which are taken from natural reason and inspiration, especially in what is common to all religions, although religions differ here." After mentioning some topics on which religions, all religions, not just the three monotheistic religions, agree, Averroes goes on to say, "Religions are, according to the philosophers, necessary, since they lead towards wisdom in a way universal to all human beings. The philosopher is under obligation to choose the best religion of his period, even when they are all equally true for him, and he must believe that the best will be abrogated by a still better one." For Averroes, who follows Plato as understood in the Arabic Aristotelian tradition, religion has a social and educational role. All religions, he writes, strive to accomplish this role, and they are measured according to their success in achieving it. Although Averroes is unusual in his strikingly explicit formulation of this position, he was not unique in holding similar views. Ibn Masara's two short extant treatises suggest that he leaned in this direction too. Following a very different school of thought from Averroes, Ibn Masara is less interested in religion as a social and educational instrument. For him, the goal of religious teaching, like that of contemplation, is the salvation of the individual. Notwithstanding the strong Muslim coloring of Ibn Masara's soteriology, his repeated allusion to the fitra indicates that he too envisaged a path that transcends the established religions. The Jewish Aristotelian Maimonides, on the other hand, is, as we have seen, clearly very close to Averroes regarding the role of religion in human history. Whereas Averroes suggests that the philosopher should adhere to the chronologically last religion, namely Islam, Maimonides regards the Mosaic law, namely Judaism, as irreplaceable. But they share an instrumental view of religion, and both of them consider religions to be evolving historical phenomena. For them, all established religions, including their own, are distinct from the pure apprehension of the one God, which is not anchored in elaborate religious laws. For Maimonides, the history of the Jewish religion as such begins not with Abraham, but rather with Moses, who set the most perfect religious law possible. For him, on one level, to the extent that one can talk of an historical Abrahamic religion, it is identified only with Judaism, while Christianity and Islam are viewed either as corruptions and imitations of the true revelation or as preparation for its accomplishment. But on another level, Maimonides' Abrahamic religion is also not identical with Judaism as the religion of Moses. Like Adam and like the Sabians, Abraham is for Maimonides a generic rather than an historical figure, preceding the historical religions and surpassing their practices. Abraham offers Maimonides a model of the pure universalist monotheist, the one who called the name of the Lord, God of the universe, a verse which Maimonides adopted as his motto. We can thus say that for some medieval philosophers, the religion of Abraham did offer a common religious platform, though not limited to the three religions we call today Abrahamic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stroumsa, for that wonderful, enlightening, stimulating talk. There's so much to discuss in that, and I'm sure we have a lot of thoughts and questions. And we're fortunate today to have another guest who will join us and really sort of start the exploration of these themes, Jessica Andruss. And I think Jessica's on the camera now here. Welcome, Jessica. Jessica Andruss is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia, as well as Mellon Fellow at the Institute for the Humanities and Global Cultures there. She received her PhD at the University of Chicago in 2015, studying medieval Karaites such as Salman ben Yeruch, and her research focuses on Karaite and other Jewish texts in Arabic, especially translations and commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. And she's published, for example, studies of figures such as Abraham ibn Hasdai, the wisdom and pedagogy of parables in Abraham ibn Hasdai's The Prince and the Ascetic, and written reference articles on him, on Ibn Hasdai as well, for the Encyclopedia of Islam. And she continues to work on many intersections between Jewish and Muslim intellectual and cultural history in the medieval Islamicate world. So she's really a wonderful person to have here. It's a real treasure to have both of you together in the same space to discuss. And so I'll hand things over to you, Jessica, who can you can lead the way with discussion however you like. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you and to Professor Wollenberg, and of course to Kelsey for all of her organization and the invitation in the first place. I should say at the outset that I have had the pleasure of hearing Professor Stroumsa speak once before, also at the University of Michigan. So this was a wonderful opportunity to speak with her again. And I'm very sorry, as I know everyone is, that we can't be physically together, especially because I have such really beautiful memories of being in Michigan. I think it was in the early fall, and it was just lovely. And I particularly remember the building that the conference was held in was just exquisite. So I have very happy memories of that time. Thank you very much, Professor Stroumsa, for this wonderful talk, which gives us so much to really dig into. I had in mind that we could kind of begin by just, if you would be so kind, allowing me to ask questions, kind of working our way through the talk. And my hope is that by the end of our conversation today, we could start to perhaps speculate on some questions about what all of this material might, what the ramifications of all of this material might be for us as scholars today. You began the talk by invoking the sort of secular context in which I think most of us are most accustomed to hearing this term, Abrahamic religions, today. And I thought if we could eventually work toward our own scholarship today, that would be a useful ending point for our conversation, as well as an opening point for the Q&A to follow. So one of the things that I was really struck with in the way that you set up these different categories is the possibility for there to be a temporal or chronological element to them that would perhaps account for development. So for example, starting with the term Hanif, this term seems to be to some degree fossilized, that Abraham and those those great prophets of the pre-Islamic era could have been part of a group of hunafat, or perhaps as individuals, and that they had a certain spiritual orientation or openness that perhaps was independent of a particular religious tradition, and that after the time of the Prophet Muhammad's revelations, that window may be closed in a sense, that we don't continue to hear about Hanifs being on the religious landscape. And if that is the case, could Abrahamic be a term that sort of meets the term Hanif chronologically, and then is able to expand forward in time, so that we can talk about an Abrahamic person at any point in history, whereas the term Hanif is kind of left behind in a pre-Islamic era?
This is an excellent question, and I think it would probably, I'll carry it with me to think about afterwards, but now I'll try to answer as best I can as I think about it now. Let's separate the two concepts. Hanif has periods of fossilization. There's no doubt about that. Not immediately after Muhammad. We find in the Middle Ages, we find a person like Shahrastani trying to revive the term and to use it he creates a kind of dispute between the Hanifs and the Sabians, where he tries to bring both figures to life. So he tries to make the term Hanif in the 12th century relevant to people of his own time. But on the other hand, he can do that because nobody else uses the term Hanif. So in some ways, it is fossilized. Then there is a period where it's not used that often. Today, however, you would hear the term used in polemical literature, in modern polemical literature. People bring it up. And when they do it in the way we saw here, that we are the Hanif. You are the one who spoil religion. We are the Hanif. We have the fitra. So fossilized terms have a way of being resurrected in some ways and coming back to life.
That is absolutely fascinating. May I ask a clarification about that point? Yeah. So when it comes up then in these contemporary polemical contexts, is it a way of saying Hanif as Muslim, or Hanif as a kind of reclaiming a primordial religion that is in some way separate from Islam?
Hanif as Muslim, which is identical with the primordial religion.
I see, okay.
So there is no difference. It's, we are the Hanif, we have the fitra, and this is us. So that is what concerns the term Hanif, the development of the term Hanif. Regarding the figure of Abraham, since Jews and Muslims read about him all the time, he doesn't need to be resurrected, but what we see with Abraham, you could say that not what we see is not death and resurrection, or fossilization and resurrection. What we see is a kind of transmigration, that he goes through various avatars. So in different periods, people use the same term, trying to fossilize it, trying to canonize it, trying to fix it. The moment they try to fix it, they actually change it. Mm-hmm. And then a generation later, or 3 generations later, someone would come and say, well, by fixing it, you changed it. This is not the right way. My way of reading it is the correct way. So we see a constant reinterpretation of the name, certainly more frequently than the term Hanif. But that again is only what I think. As I speak, I'll probably have a better answer later on.
Well, your comments, I think, just affirm that there's a way in which we can line up all of these terms as equals, whether it's Hanif or religion of Abraham or Dina Fitra, that these things are all the same. And yet we see that they're used in different ways, that there are some perhaps gaps in the ways that they're lined up. Now, I really appreciated your reflections on Fitra and the way that this term or this concept fits into this landscape. And something I wanted to ask more about is the way that you could position Fitra with respect to reason and revelation. So we're very comfortable with these terms and the tensions between them, but also the ways that medieval religious thinkers, is certainly in a rationalist vein, asserted that reason and revelation were complementary and confirmed one another and so on. And I see that Fitra has resonances with both of those, whether we're talking about rational and revealed commandments or just the notions of a revelation and rational inquiry. How do you see Fitra as being related, or kind of on a map? How could you place Fitra in connection with those categories?
Well, I would first say that Fitra is in the eye of the beholder. And let me make a transgression to the again to Abraham. When you look at the Talmud or the Midrash, or you speak to even some people today, people will tell you, or the Midrash tells you, that Abraham observed all the laws that were given to Moses, and as they were interpreted later by the rabbis. So we sort of pull Abraham with us to be like us. In some ways, Fitra can function in the same way. So you would see very orthodox thinkers in the Middle Ages and up to today who would say Fitra, of course, includes all the laws that were given to Muhammad. And this is rational, because revelation it's rational of you to accept the revelation. It's irrational to deny the revelation. So this is one way, which is not the way we would automatically expect. But then there is with Fitra, because it is such a vague and at the same time central notion, it also allows for a different interpretation, which pulls away from revelation, which pulls towards rationality, or at least pulls away from revelation in the sense of the commandments. And it becomes close to what later would be called natural religion, or the religion of reason. I believe that a turning point in this, in the interpretation in this direction, happens in Islamic Spain with Ibn Tufail, with the figure of Hayy ibn Yaqzan, who is the boy who is born on an island or is created on an island, has no parents, doesn't see, you can see that he's in a lockdown, constant lockdown. He doesn't see anybody, and he develops from his fitra, he develops, he gets as high as to encounter God. So his fitra leads him with reason to revelation. I think that the way Ibn Tufayl connected these two issues around the term of fitra and around the story of Hay ibn Yaqzan had an enormous impact afterwards, in the West mostly.
That makes wonderful sense, and that also shows how this is operating on two levels, a sort of species-wide or creation-wide level, and also through the microcosm of each individual, whether represented by Hay ibn Yaqzan or not, that there's that fitra is this sort of ingrained element from the very beginnings of creation, whether creation of the world or creation of an individual human being. And yet fitra in some sense is also the goal. There's also a process of kind of reaching the outcome to which the fitra leads,
Yes.
that we can, it's malleable precisely because it's always there in different ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. The best we can do in life, according to this perception, is not to spoil the fitra. If we could preserve it as it was given to us, this is the best. What we do during our life is stain the fitra and then try to clean it, as it were.
You know, in thinking about Abrahamic religions, as I have been for the past few days in preparation for your talk, I was reading from Saadia Gaon, and he uses another expression. He talks about the community of monotheists in precisely the way that you're seeing Abraham or religion of Abraham come up in Maimonides. In other words, by this he means Jews. In the places where he talks about the community of monotheists, it's clear he means Jews. And so I think some of the same questions I was entertaining in connection with this other term as well, that to our modern secular ears, these seem to open the possibilities of a kind of ecumenical stance. And yet when we really look at the context, it's not that at all. Right. And why do you suppose it is that these thinkers are so open to using terms that seem to mean not what they ought to mean?
Seem to us to mean not
exactly
what they ought to mean.
Right, or to put it another way, these tend to have an ecumenical ring to our ears. Why, when it's perfectly plausible to say to us Jews or to us Muslims, why the reaching out for a term that seems much broader, at least potentially?
Well, I think when they used it, they did not really use it in a broad term. What they used it in order to restrict us and not the others. Mm-hmm. For example, when Saadia says we, the community of the monotheists, he uses terms as Mu'tazilites, Muslims would use. And they say, we are the monotheists because we uphold a theology which is clean of any anthropomorphic or base presentations of God. So when they say we are the community of justice and unity, at the same time they say, and you are not, right, or they are not. And the same is true when a dynasty in Spain decides to call itself the people of unity, the Muwahidun. It's in order to say the previous dynasty was not people of unity. So to us, it sounds like a unifying thing. I don't think that that's the way they used it.
So I think one of the wonderful things about the examples that you've given us is it really shows the implicit polemical point made even in the choice of words. So now that we see this kind of attachment or sort of the appeal of a term like Abrahamic in the 21st century, do you see any lineage whatsoever between the use of this term today and the way this term appears in polemical contexts in the medieval period? Is there any connection, or is it pure coincidence that the term has emerged in our own time?
Well, it's not pure coincidence, because the material was there and was used. That's the beauty of traditions, that you can take them out of the drawer and use them anew. But I think that when it was developed in this way in the 20th century, by mostly, first of all, by Christians living in a Muslim context and trying to soften the edge of controversies between them as a minority and the surrounding Muslim society. This was material that was available, but what I think I see is a reinterpretation which is not a continuation of what was there before, which is actually going in the opposite direction, which is legitimate. Interpretation can do new things. It always has been doing that.
So then, to come at it from the other direction, so that was very helpful in understanding how we get Abrahamic today. But when we take seriously the kinds of textual and philosophical traditions that you've presented today, what does that add to our discussion or to our use of the term in our own time? And I'm thinking here of, for example, Aaron Hughes in his book on Abrahamic religion says, you know, there's a use for this term, but it's not a scholarly one. That's not the appropriate venue for using this term. And I'm wondering, do you see any openings for scholarly use of this term, bringing an awareness of the polemical past that you've presented to us?
I tend to agree with him on that, with Aaron Hughes on that. I think if I look, and I always do look for ways for discussion in today, I think the best way would be an honest way that doesn't camouflage our past, doesn't camouflage the differences there are. To my mind, it doesn't help to say, oh, we are all Abrahamic, we've always been, because it doesn't show where we came from and what are the differences that we need to deal with. And I think once it's legitimate to say, yes, not everything that was said in the past is incumbent on us. This is how they interpreted it. This is how I interpreted the text. Or I can I think even for, certainly for secular people, but for believers, it's legitimate to say, I choose this interpretation. And since the encounters that you hint at are mostly with a very strong political edge, then I think it's very important to make sure that things are presented as they are, that we don't try to make them up to suit the figure that we want to see. Because if we present them correctly, then we can face them correctly.
Thank you. I see Professor Speech here, and I'm wondering if it's time for us to hear some of the questions that have come through.
Well, yes, the discussion is so rich, it's generated some questions in the queue, and so I didn't want to leave those behind, but this is not a need to change directions or stop what we're discussing, so we can kind of try to plug these questions into the ongoing discussion, and if there's time, I'll also join in. I have a few thoughts on what we're discussing, since it's really important, and also there are interesting ways to come at it. But we'll go in order of the questions in the Q&A first, and we have a question. First, we had, even before these were submitted, 2 hands raised, and I wondered if those people had their questions. They didn't send them in, but Taira Amin, if you have a question, go ahead and submit it to me, and I'll bring it up to the front. And also Yuma Masarwa. So those 2, I don't have your questions, but I have your hand. So, but our first question is from Abdullah Galadari, who says, "Thanks, Dr. Stroumsa, for a wonderful lecture. Were the medieval Jewish thinkers who considered that even if Islam is not valid as Abrahamic, in quotes, is it at least a faith that follows Noahide laws? After all, the Noahide law requiring a judicial system must mean that there needs to be a specific halakha or sharia to be followed by that nation." So that's an interesting approach to bring in the question of whether a different metaphor suits, or whether in the past it was recognized. The Noahide metaphor is perhaps a different way to characterize the same notion. Was it ever used that way?
It was used that way. I think the question is very appropriate, because there are, if we take again Maimonides as an example, Maimonides goes out of his way to say that Islam is a monotheistic religion. It's not the religion that he wants, but it's a monotheistic religion, in that he doesn't use the term Noahide, but the way he describes it, it's a religion that does not break the laws that a human being needs to follow. There are others sometimes who would bring up the notion of Noahide, usually not in reference to Christianity or Islam, because often when the term Noahide is used, it's also a kind of a slight put down. It's like, this is the basic. It's not sophisticated enough. So even when Maimonides says that Islam is a monotheistic religion, he doesn't use the term Noahide, because that would be, maybe I would, in my terms, it would be too primitive, too basic.
That's really interesting to think of it that way, to think of it as kind of an undercut. Something that says, well, you're a law, but maybe you're not much of a law, or certainly not in the category we're talking about.
Yeah, but I should add perhaps that in earlier thinkers, Jessica, that's among the Karaites, you find people who go into the discussions of what laws are incumbent on the nations, and that goes even beyond Noahide law. What are the things that they have to do, and if they do, then they are okay.
Let's see, I wanted to bring in another question, maybe another term that we can mix into this discussion, which is from the next Q&A question, BA, I don't know who that is, but BA asks, "I saw that you translated what I assume was the word tawhid in one of the thinker's quotes as monotheism. However, from the Muslim point of view, that would be an inaccurate translation, one exhibiting Christian and Western academic bias. In an attempt to get closer to the meaning of tawhid, what would be a better translation? And broader still, do you think that quote unquote Abrahamic religions as a formulation is a way of sidestepping the problems with the concept of monotheism as used by the public or academics alike?
Well, I start from the second question or remark. Yes, people sometimes use monotheism and then they replace the term with Abrahamic because, or the people play with different terminologies that would group together three Western religions, and Islam for that in that sense is Western: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And people speak either of Abrahamic religions or monotheistic religions or of revelatory religions or of prophetic religions, because none of these terms fits 100% these three religions and only these three religions. So this is why when one doesn't fit or one is used too often, people move to the other one. As to translation, the proper translation of Tawheed, yes, I translate Tawheed or any other language, any other term to English, and I translate it to modern English. And this sounds like something that gives more or less the same idea. If you ask me what would be a more accurate or precise, I would have to ask when and by whom. Some people use Tawheed as a verb that, a transient verb, that is what you as a person, you are doing the Tawheed of God. You are unifying God. It would be very awkward to say the whole sentence in English, but in some contexts, this is what we have to say, that a person who does the Tawheed, he is proclaiming the unity of God. In some contexts, it would be more correct than the static monotheism. In other contexts, it will not be correct. So it really depends on the context of who is using it and in what context.
We have another question about terminology from Tomoko Masuzawa, who says, thank you for this great talk and Q&A. And in regard to the resurgence of Abrahamic in the 21st century, I wonder about the significance of the invention in the early 20th century in the US, 1920s or 30s, question mark, the invention of the term Judeo-Christian, which expressly excluded the Muslim. So is Abrahamic, in quotes, possibly a corrective to that?
Yeah,
well, interesting question.
I have to quote here two very good friends, Mark Silk, who discussed the beginning of the use of the term Judeo-Christian in the US, and Guy Stroumsa, who discussed the way the Abrahamic tried to correct the exclusion, especially with the resurgence of Muslim populations in Europe. Yes, I think the question points to the fact that these terms are chosen on a certain socio-political historical background in a certain context. It's not that they rise out of the text naturally. We choose them because we look for ways to accommodate issues that were raised by the historical situation, yes.
I think it's an interesting parallel debate to the very desire to find a term that somehow we can apply backwards, somehow finding our categories or our ways of thinking about religion and the way they group together from a 21st century or at least a post 18th century perspective, to find these things naturally occurring in the material always leads to this kind of thorny problem of reception. And I think Judeo-Christian has so much baggage in a different way, but it's a really interesting idea of the intentions behind a term, of wanting to exclude or not exclude, or to be wide or to not be wide. And we have another question here from Mark Herman. Given that Professor Stroumsa has shown that the figure of Abraham was not a vehicle for mutual intelligibility, can she address how Muslims, Christians, and Jews saw each other as different than or from Eastern religions, i.e. dhimmi or other non-Jewish Christian religions?
Again, the question is when. When you take a person like Maimonides or like Shahrastani, for them, the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are religions that have a prophet. And the big difference is with religions who do not have a prophet, or that they think that they don't have a prophet, and therefore are not well guided. Later on, I will not go into the modern time, but I think with the discovery of the East by the Far East by the West, the same ways that Christians in Europe saw a different regrouping of religions, trying to first show the difference with other religions, the religions of the East or of South America, and then also trying to show the similarities. I think in that way, Jews and Muslims, perhaps not synchronically, but quite close to that work in the same way as with the Christian scholars.
Lots of thoughts on the question of fitra and terminology. So Yuma Masarwa asks, for medieval mystical thinkers in particular, wasn't fitra or truth the same thing? Wasn't the truth the revelation? Is it from God? If so, why these thinkers treated their religion as the only religion? And I'm speaking about both Muslim and Jewish thinkers. And another question came back in about Noahide law. Is it analogous? Is it a Jewish analog for fitra? We might tack that on as a thought as well.
I again have to say, depends who and when. Because they all have the same text. Jews, Muslims, Christians, each one has this, they read the same people read the same texts and interpret them. And each one of them interprets them differently. So the first question, whether as a mystical tradition where truth and fitra are the same, yes, truth and fitra are the same, and they are the same as the covenant that God took from Adam's loin when he created him, that I am your God. So the mithaq of creation and the fitra and the truth can all be said to be the same things. But then others would come and say, well, if they are the same things, why are they using different terms? And they would try to show the slight difference. Some would say it all amounts to pure reasons. Others would say reason has nothing to do with it. So, and I would say the same about the Noahide law. There isn't one way that Judaism treats Noahide law. It depends who.
I think the importance of context is really essential. Definitely a theme that we're coming back to, that one of the desires we seem to be encountering in trying to find our categories in these past places and times is precisely this, the fact that we want to find a single universal category that somehow encompasses all of these different historical periods. Fred Astron asks an interesting question about, and here I'm going to shorten it because we're running short on time, but he says, theologies and justifications of dhimma imply and sometimes acknowledge shared elements of revelation and the remnants of sanctity found in non-Muslim scriptures. How does this context come into play with your materials specifically?
Okay, let me pull back a little and go back to what you said, Ryan. We are trying to find a stable definition that will connect things and then we can put them stably. But this is not a stable material. I think one of the beauties of this these studies, us studying them, they studying the text, is that it's not stable. They choose, sometimes the same person would say different things in different contexts. So some people would say, in one context, they would say, yes, we recognize that some prophets are shared by us and by the Muslims and by the Christians and the Jews. And in some contexts, they will put it forward. The same person may, in another context, stress another thing. And even the concept of dhimma has these two sides. On the one hand, yes, they are legitimate, they can stay, they are protected. For most Muslims, Jews and Christians are legitimate religions. In other contexts, they would stress the fact that they are subjugated, that they have to be humiliated, that they are not really legitimate. And the same person may use stress at one point, this side, and in another side. In some contexts, we would see the term dhimma as the hard separation between what we call monotheists, or the three monotheistic religions, and all the rest. And in other contexts, we see the dhimma applying to Zoroastrians, and even to Indians, to Hindus. So I think as we learn, as we are introduced to these terms, we try to find one definition of them. But then as we read them again through the prism of different thinkers, this is different interpretations. And it's the thread of the term or the verse or the revelation that holds them together, but they do different things with it.
I think we find a really sort of compelling case of this conflict of terms, or the conflict of interpretation around terms that mean different things in different places in talking about offspring, or the notion of kind of biological, genealogical people. And I was struck by your quote that you gave from Maimonides, from I think the Mishneh Torah, where he stresses the importance of being part of the offspring of Isaac. And how in my mind, the first thing I thought of was the letter to Yemen, and him saying, well, once you kind of I think it's a letter to Yemen, where he says, once you join, once you pledge your faith and accept faith in the God of Abraham, then you are part of this tradition immediately. There is no kind of fine splitting of hairs in the way Judah Halevi might have it, where you're not quite good enough, even though you can come to the party. Here, you're part of the community. But suddenly he says something different there, and that struck me quite a lot because of the use of the word offspring. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about this. This is certainly something that comes up now when we talk about, say, the racism of Judah Halevi, if that's an appropriate term, versus Maimonides' universalism, and how we want to think about biological transmission or genealogical communities in a way that they probably were not at all thinking. And it's a really clumsy kind of encounter between our terminology and theirs. So I wondered if you had a thought about that.
I think you're referring to his letter, to Maimonides' letter to Ovadia, the proselyte.
Yeah. That's the one, sorry.
And in this letter, he exactly tries to tell him, once you join our community, you are Isaac. You are the progeny of Abraham. Now, again, Maimonides has a verse, and he cannot change the verse. The verse says, Ki beyitzchak yikare lecha zera. You will be called, your progeny will be named by Isaac. And he, being in a polemical context, he stresses that's Isaac, that's not Ishmael. Although the verse didn't say not Ishmael. The context says not Ishmael. But then he has to explain, what does it mean, Isaac? Isaac is anyone who joins the Jewish community. And in that sense, it doesn't matter whether he came from Christianity or Islam or from an Indian religion or any other religion. Once he joins in, he is the spiritual, we can say that he has a Paulinian concept of progeny. Those who have the faith are the sons of Abraham, are Isaac. But again, it's his interpretation.
Yeah. Very striking contrast with that other quote from Averroes and the notion of the relativism of ongoing, of revelation and ongoing abrogation.
I think it's the difference between the minority thinker and thinker of the majority. I'm sure that Maimonides read Averroes, and he had a lot of respect for him. He even says so. There are things that as a Muslim in a world dominated by Islam, Averroes thought that he can allow himself to go that far. Maybe in another era, Maimonides could have followed, but Maimonides was the head of a beleaguered community under attack. And all the time he has to prove why Judaism is not abrogated by Islam. So the choice to speak about all religions being equal and let's abrogate one by the other, he doesn't have that choice. If he thought so, he cannot say it. It's too dangerous for his community, not for himself.
I think we're very short on time, and I don't want to abuse your goodwill, but I want to make sure we address these last two little questions. And just very briefly, one has to do with contemporary political implications of what you presented. It says, from a Zionist Christian affiliation with connecting themselves to Israel via Abrahamic lineage, to territorial claims about the Ibrahimi Mosque or Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron, how might any of this kind of these theories be brought to bear or not on these political claims today? Do you see this rhetoric being tossed around?
You know, I greatly enjoy the privilege of being stuck in the dark Middle Ages. I think the way these terms are activated now by different people, some were mentioned in these questions, others were not mentioned, is dangerous. It's not, it's a dangerous way to activate the text and use them as if, use them out of context and out of respect for today's context. So when we face political situations today, I would say that we have to have both eyes open rather than put a fog of texts and terms over them. It's difficult enough as it is. So I would stay away from activating terms in order to apply them. We need our own terms.
Absolutely. Well, I have one last thought here from Ehud Ben Zvi, who asks just in a quick question, we do not have texts coming from the Isawiya, but would you like to compare their approach to that of Maimonides in relation to Islam? Question. Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, but we don't have a text, so we
it's all
can.
speculative.
Yeah, no, there is. We have rumors recorded by heresiographers of groups that try to put prophets on the same level, and in that sense to be more open to prophets from other traditions. That's as far as we can go, I think.
Well, it's a nice sentiment, definitely. Although we can't take it any further. I really want to thank you, Professor Stroumsa, and you, Professor Andruss, for really what a wonderful discussion this has been. Your presentation was rich and thought-provoking in many ways, and I think we'll all continue to be kind of turning it over and probably come up with more questions. So I just wanted to thank you for your participation today and to thank all of the participants for their questions. I also, by way of closing, just want to draw everyone's attention to the next talk in this series, which will take place again on April 20th, again a Tuesday at noon, same Zoom channel here, at least maybe the same place more or less. And that's the Buddha in the 10th to 17th century Muslim, Christian, and Jewish narratives, delivered by Shatta al-Mutawwa and in discussion with Dalia Yasharpur. So please join us for that, which will continue this and then maybe think about some of the same themes, contact with other religions outside of this sphere of Abraham or Noah, or the monotheisms of the Mediterranean. Thank you again, Professor Stroumsa.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone, in good health. Thank you.